moment. Absolutely. There we go. So one of the things that we often watch that's pertinent is how many siblings, birth order. Were you an only child, or did you have siblings?
I am a middle child.
Middle child.
Yes, struggling to be heard. I account for the fact that I play electric violin.
And were either of your siblings musical?
My brother started violin when I did, but he quit as a teenager.
Okay.
He just sort of wasn't really his thing. My sister never really.
Okay. Older brother or
Older brother.
Older brother.
Yeah.
So you had to be better than older
Yeah,
brother.
exactly.
And how old were you when you first started?
5.
5 years old. Okay.
Yeah, I'll tell you a quick story. I was 4, and I was on my trike on my street. We lived in this little, street in Peekskill, New York. And I was riding down the street, and I wasn't supposed to go, too far down the street. I was 4. But going down there a little further than I had been, and I heard this music. Now, I did not realize that there was a young violinist who was a concertmaster, young in his 20s, concertmaster of an orchestra, very good violin player, and but I didn't know that, no idea. So I'm riding down, and I hear this beautiful music coming out of this window from a house. And it was the opening of Scheherazade, right? And so I'm listening to this high, beautiful stuff. I'm like, who is this woman singing? I never heard the voice like that. It's so pure and wonderful and high, So I turn around on my track and I ride home, and I get my brother, 2 years older. He's 6, so he knows everything. And I said, Brian, you got to listen to this. There's some lady that lives on our street. She's got this voice like you can't believe. It's like, like, what? So he gets on his bike. We go down there. Sure enough, there it is again. We hear this music. I said, who is that lady? He goes, you don't know very much about music, do you? I'm like, why? And he goes, that's not a lady singing. That's someone playing the flute. So I went home and I told my parents I wanted to play the flute. And they're like, what? They figured it out, and that's how I started playing. I started taking lessons from this guy down the street.
Wow. Wow. So was that experience really what spurred it, or was it more of your parents kind of seeing a bit of an interest and then pushing you towards it?
Well, it was that, and they had gotten us, me and my brother, a record of David Oistrakh playing Chanson Poème and Rondo Capriccioso, and LP, and I just loved that thing. I would play it over and over and over again. And I just fell in love with the sound of the double stops and stuff in the chanson, and I had one of these records back. This is in the mid '60s. One of these records of like excerpts of violin concertos, in stereophonic sound, and there was a little segment on there, probably not more than 2 minutes, of the Sibelius Violin Concerto. And it was that wonderful moment, if anyone knows the piece, there's this just rapturous section where it's all in high sixths, and it's gorgeous, and it's passionate. And I would play that thing, just put the needle back, and I would put it, and I would just play it hundreds of times. And so I'm sure my parents like, what's up with it?
Okay.
But I was just very moved, even as like a 5-year-old, 4-year-old, by the sound of that. So,
Wow.
so they noticed that.
Very good. Very good. All right. So from there, we get this picture of a very young Tracy Silverman who's enraptured by this music. But from there to was it your teacher or was it your parents who first realized, okay, this is an uncommon level of ability that this young man has?
I guess I was progressing along, I think, at a pretty normal pace, By the time I was 8, I'd been playing for 3 years, and I was doing, easy pieces, and I think like, slow movement of a Handel sonata or something like that. And the Juilliard School had just moved to Lincoln Center, and they opened, I think it was in '68 there. And there must have been something about it that my parents had read, and they were open for pre-college, and so we auditioned down there. I got in, which was not terribly difficult for the pre-college, anybody with a reasonable amount of talent, they were happy to, have. So, so I started doing that. And then it sort of became my thing, because the way these things happen with kids, if the parent starts to prioritize it, and it's like, well, we're going to drive an hour down to New York, we'll have breakfast, and we'll have your lesson, and we'll drive back, and it becomes your Saturday every week. And I did that, I think, for 2 years, and then I starting to get pretty good. By the time we moved to Wisconsin, there was no good teacher there, so we found out the only really teacher worth studying with was all in Chicago, so it became a little higher priority. And so now, okay, we're going to do this, and if we're going to do this, then you better practice, because my dad was driving 4 hours every Saturday. And sat in the lessons and was deputized by my teacher.
Wow.
Because he knew everything I was supposed to do. And so the teacher would say, now your father's a witness, so, and you, when I'm not there during the week, your father is the deputy, and, he's the law. So, if he tells you you're playing out of tune, you got to listen to him. So, he became sort of a surrogate teacher. And as we all know, because of the Suzuki method has really, made this clear. The parents' involvement is everything. If the parents aren't supportive, if they're not there actually listening, at least to some of the practice sessions, it makes a huge difference. It's much easier for the teacher, and it's much easier really for the student to have that kind of constant attention. And as a kid, I think, it was not just a matter of making me into a better player. I think it really made me take it much more seriously because, wow, my parents think this is important and are actually sitting there and listening to me practice. This must be important.
Was that intimidating to have a parent sitting in there on the
No,
lesson?
it was annoying.
Yeah.
My dad would be downstairs and he would just yell up, "That's a C sharp."
So he had pretty good ears. He could,
Yeah,
he
well,
could police you pretty well.
if I would stop practicing for a minute, and if it was more than a minute or two, he'd like, "What's going on?" So it was just, it made it a little more rigorous.
Okay. Did you start out early? I know a lot of string teachers use Suzuki. Did you start out in the Suzuki method
No.
early on? No.
No, there was no Suzuki back when I started.
Okay.
So I started, with a traditional.
Gotcha.
I never did Suzuki.
Okay. I know that a much smaller percentage of piano teachers use it, but a lot of strings teachers
Yeah.
have a lot of success with it.
Yeah.
So. Okay. Very good. So when you move out there and now you're driving these 2 hours, and is that, what would you say as far as your teachers, do you have a standout from that period as far as a teacher who had more influence, or was it more, as you say, the parental influence?
No, I had a very good teacher. This guy in Chicago, Morris Gomberg, was the head of Chicago Musical College string department.
Okay.
And he had some pretty well-established students and was quite well-known in Chicago, and was an amazing teacher. He really taught me. He died when I was 13, so I only had 3 years to work with him. But in those 3 years, he taught me basically how to practice, which was just so influential to me. And he broke things down just very clearly and just laid it out and just was so patient and would tell me, "Take it back to the cleaners." That was his line, And we worked on, for instance, we kind of bit off a little more than I could chew. We started working on the Saint-Saëns Violin Concerto, B minor, which is a really difficult piece, full of just, real pyrotechnics and stuff like that, which I was not ready for. But he felt that he wanted me to do that, I think because he knew he was sick. He didn't have a lot of time, so he was trying to sort of download all of this information to me. And I think he recognized that I had some talent, and he really wanted to try to make stuff stick. So we worked on that concerto for about a year, every week. And I remember the opening section of that, we probably worked for about 3 months, just every week. And it's like, there were these details, and I don't remember those, all the details of the lessons, but he was really focusing on working in a very, almost myopic way, really looking at things closely, which I had never done and was not my, as a 10 or 11-year-old kid, is not natural for an 11-year-old boy to do, you know. So, but he really instilled in me a way of how to drill things, how to put metronome down, move it up one notch at a time, simple stuff like that we take for granted, but made a huge impact on me. And then when he died, his assistant became my teacher for the next 4 years or so, and it was also amazing.
Okay.
So I was really lucky to have teachers like that.
When did you start performing?
Well, my debut was when I was 13. I won this Chicago Symphony Youth Audition. And that's kind of why he was working on this piece with me for a year. Because he had it in his mind that if I got it up to the right level, they would enter me in this thing. So we did, and I won the thing, won first place in it, and I played with Chicago Symphony 6 times the next year. So that was really, my first.
I knew the answer to that, but I had to ask. Very good, very good. So then you continue to work with his assistant until you graduate high school then, right?
Yeah.
The next 4 years. And then...
Well, I didn't really graduate high school.
Okay.
I left after 10th grade, actually, when I was 16, and went to Chicago Musical College to study with that teacher, Deborah Wood. Because my high school was kind of a loser high school, and it really was. And I was, they were taking me out of school an hour or two early to go practice because I was starting to do these competitions and stuff like that when I was about 16. What was happening was my parents were moving from Wisconsin. And so rather than move me in my 11th grade year, junior year of high school, to the Philadelphia area, where I wouldn't be with my teacher, who I've been working with for so long, they decided, well, maybe we can get you into college early and you can just stay there. So that's kind of what happened.
So what point, there's that moment when, it's like we see young students who do this because it's just kind of what we do for a long time. And then there's a moment when it's like, okay, I'm going to be a grown-up one day, and this seems like a viable option for a career. Mm-hmm. When did that happen for you?
Well, I guess, by the time I started, Chicago Musical College, I was 16. I was kind of on this fast track. I was their prodigy kid because I was so young. I had won the symphony thing. I'd won a few other little competitions and was sort of their wunderkind, in a small, in a small lake, big fish. So that made me take it seriously, and everybody assumed that this was what I was going to do, and I was going to, have a career of some kind. Gotcha. And then I did a year there, and then I actually transferred to Juilliard the following year. Started studying with a guy named Ivan Galamian there, who was a famous, pedagogue there. And then I was a very small fish in a very big pond. And the classical music career looked very different to me suddenly when I was, got to New York, and I was in school with Bobby McDuffie and Nadja Sternberg, and lots of people who were already having major careers, had won the big competitions in Europe and were these real stars. And I saw the people, pianists in the practice rooms, literally 12 hours a day. Just constant practice. And I was really getting I was always interested in composing. And I was increasingly interested in popular music, in Jimi Hendrix and guitar players that my brother, had been listening to a lot. My friends in school listened to. And a few things started happening. I started realizing that all the masterpieces of music were written in a contemporary um, popular idiom. Mozart was writing in the popular Viennese style of the day. Tchaikovsky was writing in the very accessible, popular Russian style. Um, and I was looking at classical music that was being written in the then in the 70s, which was really off-putting. And the popular music, which was very accessible, and I went, well, what's going on here? This is the stuff that all the great composers were writing. Was, our corollary would be rock music and pop music. And if Tchaikovsky were around, he would probably be writing an electric guitar concerto, not a violin concerto. So what's going on here? And so I sort of took a shift. One day I opened the Schwann catalog. Anybody remember the Schwann catalog? It's a big, thick thing of all of the records in print. I think it's still around, actually. And I was looking for some recording of the Tchaikovsky violin concerto. And I'm going through and I'm flipping pages, and there's 6 or 7 pages of entries, probably 150 recordings in print of the. I was like, and I just closed the book, and I said, kind of closed the book on a chapter of my life. I said, the world really doesn't need another Tchaikovsky violin concerto recording. As much as I love it, which I really did. And so I was kind of at a loss. It was like, I read this book called The Agony of Modern Music, which I still own on loan from the Juilliard Library. Because it was so influential to me, because it really pointed out to me, made very clear that the modern music of every age was popular until now, So I took that as my sort of credo, and I went, I'm going to try to do what Gershwin did, which was to integrate popular music into a more concert setting, which is what Gershwin and Tchaikovsky and Mozart and Beethoven and everybody else did. So that kind of really took me in a very different path. I stopped after I did graduate. I wanted to drop out of school. My dad insisted I stay. I'm glad I did, because I do have the diploma on my wall, which intimidates my students. That's not all. But after I graduated, I really kind of put the violin in the case and started looking into electric violins, which did not really exist. So I had to build them, get guitar players to make them, figure out what strings to put on them, because I wanted a 6-string that would go as low as a guitar. So I started this, years of research and development into something that really hadn't been done yet, which was playing the electric violin in a more serious way. Really, nobody was playing the electric violin at all except Jean-Luc Ponty, who was doing jazz stuff with it. Was learning jazz, playing in jazz clubs in New York for the first time, which I really didn't know what I was doing, but just trying to learn stuff with a friend of mine who was an improvising piano player from Juilliard. So I really started, I took a whole different career path at that point.
Wow. What was that like to go from like the pinnacle of classical training to playing jazz clubs in New York just that fast?
Well, the biggest obstacle in my career at that point actually was my parents, because they were really, my father, after years of driving all of those miles on our Dodge Dart, yeah, he was kind of heartbroken, because, everybody thought I was going to be this soloist. I had this promising career, and I was throwing my talent away. And, he would constantly make me say, like, well, how much longer are you going to try this rock thing? And, before you go back. And he was really worried because I wasn't practicing. I was losing time, losing my chops a little bit. And in fact, what I was very intentionally doing, although I didn't quite understand with the perspective that I have now, but I was retraining myself. I was learning how to play rock. I was changing my vibrato. I was changing my bow hold. I was changing where I held the violin. I was holding it with a strap all the way down here, which forced me to change my technique. I couldn't play these things down here because I couldn't get up the neck. And I was really reprogramming all of this muscle memory to not sound classical because I knew that there was nothing worse than a classical player trying to play rock and sounding classical. You know, I knew I wanted to sound authentic. So I was listening to guitar players really trying to imitate Jimi Hendrix, the vibrato, the attack, the tone, all of those things, the note choices, learning jazz, and all of this kind of stuff. And all the while letting my classical playing intentionally kind of atrophy. Because I knew that, in fact, the whole idea of playing the violin down here was very intentional because I knew that when I put it back up here, I went right into Bach and Mozart. And the bow stroke was different, and so I had to kind of force myself. It was almost like I was playing the guitar. It's like I was learning a whole different instrument. I did learn how to play guitar. In fact, in my last year at Juilliard, I broke my wrist. Couldn't play for 3 months. Had a cast all the way up to here. And so that really, you know, helped me make this shift. And I guess the reason I'm going into all of this detail, you know, about my personal path with this, is that I think it's important as teachers, because I do a lot of teaching. I teach at Belmont, and I teach rock and jazz over at Belmont. I don't teach classical. But I think it's really important as teachers that we recognize that sometimes students are in funny places where they need to do stuff for their own reasons. Now, most of them don't. Most of them aren't really at that point, certainly not when they're young. But if you have students who are at a point like that, where they're making these critical decisions, do I go to music school? Do I go to, you know, med school or whatever? Sometimes, you know, sometimes they have to pull themselves away from something that they've done. And, you know, like I said, it broke my parents' heart for years, and especially because I was having no success with what I was doing. I was in New York. I started rock bands. I was playing in these horrible divey clubs, spending money, not making any money, spending a bunch of money that I was doing weddings on the weekends and working on, with my classical violin, making money. I learned how to be a strolling violin player. I was like doing all this stuff, and all of the money went into my band and just went down the, you know, down the you know, the drain of the money pit. You know, having a studio, paying musicians, making demos, all of that stuff. So, and they were constantly like, when are you going to have enough of this and get back on track, you know? And it really wasn't, I don't think, until a couple of years ago when I played Carnegie Hall that they finally came around like, yeah, I guess this is working out for you, you know? Because, you know, they really had a vision of what I was going to be, and as a parent, I know how hard that is to let go of that and let your kid just go the path that they need to.
I'm so glad you spoke to that, because that's exactly where my next question, from a teacher's perspective, was going. Is what that was like, and because we see that. I know my situation was exactly the opposite. My parents were not fans of classical music, but my teacher was heartbroken when I started to gravitate away from that, and it took her a while to become supportive. I can only imagine that you didn't have much support at Juilliard for those decisions. Was there anybody there who was an advocate for you as you were going through that? It was just, wow.
There really wasn't. It was a very, very lonely time for me. First of all, Juilliard was a very lonely place. Anyway, I don't want to burst anybody's bubbles, and I don't generally publicly speak negatively about Juilliard at all. But, and I think it's changed somewhat, but it was a really, as you can imagine, competitive place. But there was just no social life at all. There was no dorms, so everybody was just scattered all around the city. There was there was just no fraternity, sense of brothership there at all. It was everybody, every man for himself. And so my teacher um, actually, to give you an idea how conservative that is in the classical, narrow classical world, they didn't even want me to. He didn't even want me to freelance classically. He said, you don't want that life of waiting for the phone to ring, for orchestras, are you going to play in this orchestra or that orchestra or Broadway pit? He had no idea I was thinking of being in a rock band, That, he would have had a conniption fit. But for them, even just being a freelance musician was beneath anybody. So that's the kind of blinders that they have on there.
Wow. Wow. So walking out of that chapter, then you make this shift, and you're in the lost and lonely world of pop music now.
Yeah.
Looking back, you're a teacher now, and we're all teachers here. I would imagine that you experienced the gambit of both really collegial and supportive teachers and really hard teachers. Pros and cons to each of those, and what did you take from any of those, either side of that you use with your students today?
You mean teachers of me, or just other teachers that I see at Belmont or something?
More like your teachers. Are there any of your teachers, the experiences you had with your teachers, that you infuse into how you coach your students? And were there pros and cons to having a more supportive collegial type versus the harder type?
Well, when I graduated Juilliard, I stopped taking lessons really. So my experience with teachers were very classical and pretty dogmatic. Galamian at Juilliard, for instance, published his own editions of the Bach sonatas, and he had his own scale book, which in the string world is still one of the most commonly used. So he was a very famous guy as an editor and publisher and writer of violin pedagogy. He taught Perlman, Zuckerman, Michael Raven, who was a big name who died, unfortunately, young. But to give you an idea, I came into my first lesson. I had been studying in Chicago with my teacher, Deborah Wood, come in with the G minor sonata, the first solo sonata. So my first lesson with Ivan Galamian, and I'm playing her bowings and fingerings that I've been studying for the last couple of years. And he listened to me play the whole thing through with this sort of bemused look on his face. And when I'm finished, he gets up to me and he walks up to the stand and he goes, "You make your own edition, maybe?" And sits back down and he goes, "Next week you bring my edition." And that was the end of that lesson. So, not sure how supportive that was. I think what I got from that was what not to do. Sometimes they say your parents bad parenting can be good for kids too, because they learn what not to be, and that's important too. And so I learned the value of having an open mind and having a sense of what the student needs. And so I have a very different style of teaching, as you can imagine, because my background is very eclectic. My other teacher in Chicago, who had been preparing me for Juilliard, was very classical, wonderful teacher, very supportive, in the sense that she made me feel like I could do anything in the world if I practiced hard enough. That was the message. You put in the work and you practice properly, you can learn any piece. So that was an important message, and also backed up with how to achieve that. So I had a very good work ethic from that, very disciplined. I would practice 4 or 5 hours a day. I would drill passage work for hours, and I could do it. And then I had the chops to prove it. So that was a great learning experience to know that work ethic, you put in the time, you get this result. So that's something that I obviously impart to my students, to my kids. But I really had to figure out the rest on my own. You know, I had to figure out. I didn't have anybody supporting me trying to be in a rock band. In fact, I had so many people telling me that this was a mistake. This can't be done. Why do you think it's never been done? Why do you think there are no rock bands led by electric violins that don't have guitars in the band, where the violin is substituting for the guitar? Because that's what I was doing. You know, it can't be done. It sounds terrible. There's no equipment. You have to make your own violin. Why are you, blah, blah, blah. Went on and on and on. And I spent 10 years banging my head against the wall in New York until I finally just had enough in New York. I was so burned out. Moved to Minneapolis and started doing it there, and there was a little more of an underground rock scene there that I fit into a little bit better. So, you know, I had to just find that support within, basically.
Have you had students at Belmont or students with whom you worked who have kind of a transition like that, who may get away from the classical training at some point, and how do you know to recognize that, when to support it or when to say, hang in here, you need to stay on this?
Yeah. Well, the world is so different now. And Belmont is so different from Juilliard in the sense that it's so eclectic. And our string department there, we pride ourselves on having Juilliard trained classical, the head of the department, Elizabeth Small, who's an amazing teacher, fundamentals, foundationary kind of stuff. And someone who teaches just fiddling, bluegrass, and Celtic and folk styles, Tammy Rogers King. Myself doing rock and electric violin. I got them to hire a couple of people because I had so many students that I couldn't teach because I was traveling so much. I basically gave them all to Billy Contreras, who's an amazing jazz player, Buddy Spiker, who's a legend in the Texas swing world. They're both now on adjunct faculty. And we encourage the students to do a round robin, basically, in semesters, and study with everybody and get a really holistic string background so that you know how to improvise. And that's something I really wanted to emphasize to you guys today. When I was thinking about, you know, what I would talk about, how important it is to let your students improvise, to encourage them to improvise, to encourage them to write. And this is something that I do with all of my students. And I insist that they write their own music. This is not optional. You have to write music. I feel as I can't express how strongly I feel about this. You cannot play music unless you also write it. You can't just be an interpreter. That it's you can't. Well, I mean, obviously people do, but you really are not doing justice to the music that you love if you don't spend some time trying to figure out what it takes to take an idea from your head and put it down on paper and let somebody else play it and see what happens. See how your ideas didn't make it across to somebody, or they see it and they see something completely different in that. And by taking the perspective of watching somebody else interpret your music, that's the only way that you can then interpret somebody else's music. Because you have to see you have to know what the other side of that conversation looks like. So all my students write. It doesn't have to be good. It doesn't have to be even original terribly. It can be very derivative. That's fine. Write a piece like Mozart. Write a piece like Jimi Hendrix. I don't care. But write something. And improvise. You have to, in order to understand your instrument, in order to understand your idiom, whether it's classical, jazz, rock, whatever it is, you have to be able to move freely in that. That's what classical musicians have always done until the last, 50 or 60 years, when it's become less important. Classical musicians always knew how to improvise in their idiom. It's just part of your job, I think. It's just simply part of your responsibility. And you become a much better musician for doing that. You become a much better teacher for doing that, because you can recognize in your students when they, I don't know, do you guys have students? When I was a kid, they would give me a piece, and I would learn the piece, and I would go, yeah, but I like it better like this, right? You have students, especially younger students, right? 7 or 8-year-olds or 10-year-olds will go, you go keep correcting something, right? And they'll go, finally, sometimes they'll do it, and they won't say it. If they're shy, they won't say it. But if you have a kid who speaks his mind, they'll say, yeah, but I like it better like this, And whereas there's a time and a place for getting something right, I really think it's important to tell those kids, if there's any spark of that in a kid, to go, you know what, it's fine, this is the way the composer wanted it, but it's okay to do it this way. In fact, what else would you change? What would the piece sound like if you wrote this piece? How would you rewrite the whole piece? You don't have to just change this little part. Rewrite the whole thing, bring it in next week. See what happens, see what they come up with, and watch how their playing changes from week to week when they start writing their own pieces and trying to play stuff. Suddenly they're trying to play stuff you haven't taught them. They're doing stretches with their hands they're not supposed to be doing. They're jumping to get stuff, because suddenly the mother of invention, they're trying to do something because they hear it, rather than just following numbers, It's a completely different perspective on music. I have 4 kids. I haven't pushed any of them to play music. I have my older girls, gave violin lessons for a little bit. They just didn't really take to it. They were more into musical theater, dancing, singing, blah, 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 which is great, which they do very seriously, one of them. But my little guy, I have an 8-year-old now, and he was taking piano lessons for about a year, and was enjoying it, was having fun with it, especially at first, but he really likes Green Day, the rock band. And none of these pieces had anything to do with Green Day. But we had a guitar in the house, and he would pick up the guitar and just start banging out stuff that kind of sounded like Green Day, right? And over the summer, we took him to School of Rock, I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, over on Belmont Avenue, and for like a week-long, camp. And he would come home from camp, and as soon as he got in the door, take the guitar out of the case and play for like another 2 hours on the guitar. And this was clearly what he wanted to do. Even though he was fine with the piano lessons and enjoyed them, and it's not a piano versus guitar, it's just where his interest was. And the fact that when he started playing the guitar, he would try to do stuff on there that he didn't know how to do. And I saw the wheels turning, I saw him, because he has an obvious musical talent. I can tell he's got great time, he's got great pitch and all that kind of stuff. And he was just figuring out what he needed to know. And then he would go to the piano and try to figure it out on the piano. And he was, although he had worked through a couple of books and was making good progress with his teacher and doing what he was supposed to do, he would practice for 15 minutes, and then as soon as he was done, he was done. But he would go back to the piano now and try to learn these things and teaching himself stuff he didn't know how to do. One time, Terry Riley, the composer, was in town, and I was working with Terry. And we did this panel discussion thing at Vanderbilt. And at the end of it, we played a little bit together and did a little improv. And Terry is a very free, avant-garde pianist, composer, if you're familiar with him. Anyway, Toby was there watching, and he was 6 years old at the time, and saw Terry doing this very free kind of stuff, and knew that it was improvised, and we were bouncing. You could tell that Terry was responding to what I was playing. I was responding to what he was playing. This, for him, clicked. This clicked way more than the idea of matching fingers to numbers and stuff like that. He got what was going on. And as soon as Terry got off the stage and most of the people were out of the hall, there were still half the people were there. He ran up on stage and started just imitating Terry on the piano. banging out stuff, making little things, and then he went home and started writing songs. And he wrote a couple of little pieces of his own. And that was like, it was in A minor, it was very, consistent, kept playing the same melody over and over and over again. I was like, this is what I want to encourage. Not that playing piano, I mean, obviously I don't want to offend anybody here, but I'm just trying to make the point that the real life of a musician happens usually in a different way than the way we teach. Now, the way we teach can support that and can encourage that, but I can't stress how important it is to let them improvise, to let them go off, off the page, and let them dictate a little bit. Obviously the kid has to have some kind of talent or some kind of inspiration to do that. But I think it's our job as teachers to show that to them. If he hadn't happened to been there to see Terry Riley do that, he would never have done, what he did. So it's really important to show them videos. Take time out of your lesson and go, hey, check out this. I know this isn't anything that we're doing, but watch this crazy piano player. Watch what he can do, or something. And that's time well spent. That's I think in a kid's life more important than spending an extra 5 minutes getting something right at the piano. Sometimes, So you have to make that call, obviously, and it's a student, kid by kid. And some kids work best when they're just told what to do.
Good. I love that. All right, man, we could just go forever. That's awesome. Mr. Silverman, before we started, said that he was worried that he wasn't going to have anything that would be relatable. And after that, I could listen for hours. All right, I would be remiss. I know that we're running short on time.
Want to play a little something?
Yes, we need to. But before we do, I would be in a room full of pianists.
Yes.
You got to share a little bit of some Jim Brickman stories, or how you got connected, and what makes you guys a good collaboration.
Well, it's funny, I got a call from Jim right after the week after I left the Turtle Island String Quartet, and he had heard that I was available and called and wanted to know if I would. Actually, he wanted me to put a string quartet together to go on his tour, and so he said, "Come on down to his place in L.A." And so we played together, and then we've been playing together ever since. That was 16 years ago or something. And so I went down and heard his music. I was also on Windham Hill at that time with Turtle Island String Quartet. He was kind of their big star player on Windham Hill. And I was leaving the Turtle Island String Quartet because I really wanted to get back to my electric violin. I was playing only acoustic with them. And I was really hankering to get back into a band and to play rock. So I really didn't think that this was going to click with him at all. And it wasn't really the style that I wanted to go in. I wanted to move away from that direction, kind of, and I thought, my hair was long. I just wasn't the right guy. So I kind of came down anyway. I was like, Jim, I'll find some people for you. I can arrange some music if you need. I don't think that's your guy. And he just loved the fact that I wasn't sounding classical. Because, just in a nutshell, as you gather, because of my left turn after Juilliard, I spent a lot of time playing rock. I spent a lot of time playing jazz. I was working with Terry Riley, learning Indian music. I went to Brazil a lot, learning Brazilian music. So I had a very eclectic style and bag of tricks, and didn't sound classical, and prided myself on that kind of, that wasn't that I couldn't. I just learned a bunch of other languages. So, I was pretty multilingual on the violin, and he really liked that, and it just clicked. So, and we did a tour. We did, a holiday tour, and I was sure that, I was finished with Jim because I'd done a tour, and you don't want to bring the same guy back. He'd have shifted people every year. And he invited me back for the next year, and I was like, really, I guess, if there's nobody else to do it, I can do it, and we've been doing this for 16 years now. So there's this crazy mix of the fact that I bring this rock kind of sensibility and sense of humor to what he does, and it's one of those things where we contrast each other and we complement each other in a nice way. And sometimes it's very non-intuitive when those things happen. You can't predict, you know. But Jim's stories. Jim is a really nice guy, by the way, if anybody's wondering. I don't know if Jim Brickman fans here? Yeah. He is a very nice guy. We all have our moments. You know, when you're living in a bus with somebody for 5 or 6 weeks at a time, you'll see everybody always at the best. But always very respectful of me, and likes to be very spontaneous in some ways, and quite fearless about. He'll put a set list together, and he'll say, because of the order, we had a guest singer or something, we had to shift stuff around. Well, Tracy, let's see, why don't you just stay on stage for the song? I know you've never played on it before, but you'll get it. And he'll just like throw me into situations like that. He'll accompany people on a song where it's in a different key, and he's never played it in that key, and he'll just do it. He knows how to do it because he's been, a guy who plays jingles. He's written a lot of jingles for years before he started his solo career. Accompanies a lot of singers, and he knows how to do that. He knows how to improvise, and he is quick on his feet. He can fake it. He can fake his way through in a way that sounds very convincing. So, that's I really learned from him how you can do that in front of a couple of thousand people, and not freak out. Also, I learned from him a very important ingredient for my own performing career, which was to stay. Although it sounds like I'm saying he's out of his comfort zone, that's actually all stuff that he's pretty comfortable with, because he's comfortable changing keys on the fly and stuff. But he really taught me to stay within my comfort zone, because as a performer, I would always push myself to do stuff that I wasn't really capable of doing quite yet. That was my whole modus operandi as a kid, biting off stuff that was way harder for me. So I had this sense like, I'm really not working hard enough unless I'm trying to do something that's always harder, right? And I would put myself in positions where I was performing and always sort of on the verge, right at my limit. And I felt like I wasn't doing the right thing unless I was pushing myself that hard. And he really taught me that that's a good way to perform. It's much better to be relaxed, to be comfortable, and to be able to share and be comfortable with your audience and not be so terrified about what you're doing that you forget about the audience. So, I learned a lot from him about performing and about audience, how to deal with an audience, and a ton about the business and how to market your music and stuff like that, which he is just a genius at.
Very, very good at that. Yes, I'm always admiring of that. There's a great moment on stage when you guys are, and I don't know how many of you have been to any of the Jim Brickman shows, but even as a pianist, the highlight of it for me, the first time I saw this, there's a moment where they'll be playing some easy listening, something, very tranquil, and then Mr. Silverman will just go off on this rock tangent, and Jim will just stop playing, and it's just like 90 seconds of crazy lead guitar improv that you just completely do not expect, and everybody wakes up, and it's quite a just a bold collaboration, I think. And so the theme of today is golden collaborations. This is the 50th anniversary of the Nashville Association of Piano Guild Teachers. So golden anniversary, golden collaborations today. And we couldn't think of anyone better who's represented or really in front of hundreds of thousands of people, delighted people, a collaboration with our instrument than you. So wrapping it up before questions, where can I'm going to have your website up on the computer so people can sign up for your mailing list.
Great. Or if anybody's interested in getting my monthly newsletter or something, We can just put out a piece of paper and just get people's
Okay.
email addresses or something.
Excellent.
If that's easier.
Any current projects you're working on that you'd like to talk about?
Always working on stuff. I'm going to be at Big Ears next week in Knoxville. Big Ears Festival with Terry Riley. It's his 80th birthday year, so it's Kronos Quartet is artist in residence out there. I've been working on a new concerto by a guy named Nico Muley, who's a young composer. Premiered that a couple months ago. Doing that in Colorado, Colorado Symphony coming up at Carnegie Hall in October with the American Symphony. Doing that, orchestrating the last movement of my concerto, which is almost completely done now, which I'm playing. It's my second electric violin concerto, playing in Montana in next January. So I'm trying to finish that up while I'm working on other stuff. So it's always a lot of stuff like that. Irons in the fire.
Very good. Very good. All right. Well, I will turn it over to the group.
Do you write with pen and paper, or do you write with a pencil and paper, do you write with
Both. I usually jot stuff down. You know, I have these big notebooks. They're kind of long this way, 18 stave things, and I really like them. In fact, I got a couple of them for Terry Riley, and I sent him a couple of those and these really good pencils, these nice dark pencils, because they're so easy to work with, and it makes a big difference. I like having a lot of paper in front of me because you can see like what you would normally see on 3 or 4 sheets, or rather than having. And yes, I put stuff down on paper, jot ideas down, and then usually go back and transcribe them into Finale when I need to make up a chart for somebody, or make it into a finished kind of thing. I also write a lot using sequencing software like Pro Tools, where you can play into it, and then it will spit out a MIDI file, which you can then import into Finale and have it printed. But I like to be able to improvise when I'm writing as much as possible. I also, a lot of times, will just, since I'm a violin player, record what I'm doing, like into Pro Tools, and just have a sketch, a work piece that I'm working on, and improvise stuff, and then go back and transcribe. And that's generally, I tend to feel that as an improviser and a jazz, player, that so many of the best ideas come out like that. When you sit down and you try to work them out first, that it's somehow much more stilted and stiffer. For instance, you'll know if you write something, like if you, even an email or something, if you sit down and, or if you have a little paper to write something, you write, it becomes much more formalized. You think about your choice of words much more differently. Maybe you do a quick check to the thesaurus, and, like, it's a better word for this. And, you're writing, you're constructing something that you're writing. That's a different process than just talking off the cuff like this. And when you speak off the cuff, you may make mistakes, you may make errors, but you can go back and edit those out. But things are gonna happen in that moment where you're gonna express yourself more honestly, I think. More authentically is the word I mean, not honestly. More true to your own nature, the choice of words. And the same exact process holds for music. I may think that I may have a melody in my head, write it down or something. By the time I've written it down, it's different from the way I would have played it if I just picked up an instrument and played it. It's already changed. Already, like, yeah, I should make that a little shorter, that's better. But that may not be as authentic. And to me, the job of the composer of any artist, is authenticity. That's their job. Your job is to show the world who you are as simply as you can, with as little distraction to that. The greatest artists, Picasso, Matisse, visual artists, and the greatest musicians have a way of doing that. It's like, ooh, and it seems so easy because there's so little there. There's sometimes, it's so simple, it's so clear, but it's because all of those distracting things that are, or things that seem to contradict each other, all of that second thought, thought kind of stuff has somehow been removed so that we have the impression, at any rate, of immediacy, authenticity. And it's so hard to capture that. So the easiest way is just to turn on a tape recorder and capture it. And then go back, and if you don't like something, change it, edit it. But at least this way you have those first impressions. You know, the beat writers, Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and those guys, said first thought, best thought. Just let it go. Don't come back and even touch it. You know? So, you know, I think to a degree, if you're Jack Kerouac, maybe it's the first thought, the best thought. You know, not everybody's. But if it's not, then you're already in some way covering up or changing your authenticity. Because if your authenticity is not great, it's not great, but that's at least it's you. You know. So that's the most important thing.
I have like so many questions. I feel like bridging that gap between or the transition between classical music and rock music. Not only, well, I saw last year at Big Ears Festival, Steve Reich and Johnny Greenwood, which was amazing. Johnny Greenwood was the guitarist from Radiohead, which was like
How was that?
one of the greatest rock bands. It was great. I somehow befriended these sound guys and ended up in the sound
Nice.
booth in the Tennessee Theater right when Johnny Greenwood was playing at the famous Steve Reich piece on the guitar, and I was like, literally I had 2 seats to choose from and got to see it over and have it perfectly into my ears. But it was amazing. And Steve Reich did a talk where a lot of people, he did a big Q&A thing at one point during the weekend, and it was basically somebody asked him, okay, well, you're working on Johnny Greenwood, and Johnny Greenwood's composing all of these film scores now for Paul Anderson movies, and then there's like Steve Reich, who's in textbooks and all of that as a classical artist, and they were just kind of asking him what that's like, and he was noting how many artists these days have a classical background that are in the world of pop or rock, and it's just like an increasing thing, and that's what I see all around me, and I'm I'm like half awake, half asleep most of the time. I'm playing dive bars and things like that, playing guitar, but I'm teaching piano.
Oh, really?
And even with my parents, the parents of the students that have bridging that gap for them, a lot of them are songwriters, they're like folk or rock musicians, or working, doing publishing and stuff, and so for them, even the simple thing of like, it's important that at least once a week, we're trying once a week at this point now, at least once a week we sit down with them with this book, like it's not Suzuki we're doing here, where just to get them to even see that sitting down and practicing one day a week is not too much for their little 4-year-olds, because there's that informalness where they just want their kids to be able to do what they want. So it's like bridging that gap, because I get it. I don't want to force them to either. There's the parent involvement and stuff, but I guess I'm like rambling on now because I have so many questions. A, professionally, how have you been able to balance teaching at Belmont and being in like a classical setting while at the same time like performing? And then how have you been able to form these collaborations with people like Terry Riley and working with Carnegie Hall? For me, all that business stuff too is like, how do you go from playing foo bar on Sunday with no monitors to...
Well, this is the job, I think, of the contemporary musician. More and more, it's in the last 5 to 10 years, things have seem to have changed so much. The internet has changed everything, and contemporary composers, young, the sort of the whole new generation of composers are much more aware of pop music and integrating it, and much more synthesizing, rock and hip hop and things like that into serious concert music in a really, I think, encouraging way. This is what I was looking for back, in Juilliard that I wasn't finding. So it's really finally coming back together, and it's forcing musicians to have a lot of skills. Not only the technical skills to be able to play the piano, but to be able to improvise, to be able to know something about gear, computers, virtual synths on computers, and how to get the sounds you like, how to run it, be in a club and play a gig with a bad sound check or bad sound system or something, you know. But you bring up something that a really good point, which is that by playing in bands and writing songs in bands, I learned, I think, more doing that than I learned at Juilliard. I have to tell you. First, by the time I got to Juilliard, I already had my chops. So I didn't really increase that all that much by all the hours of practicing Paganini and stuff like that. But what I really learned after Juilliard was how to play in a group, how to write a part that works for this, how what's appropriate, how to put a set list together that's going to be right for a particular audience. Is it a rock audience? Is it more of a jazz? Is it more classical? So now I do concerts that are very mixed, and all of that, the stuff that I do now, I could not have done without having been in bands. That was incredibly useful to me. And I see my little 8-year-old in a band at School of Rock. The stuff that they're doing, learning parts, writing parts for themselves, that's real music. That's not fake music. That's absolutely as real as Bach. And totally valid. And how to work with other people in the group, having been coached by in a string quartet by Sam Rhodes of the Juilliard String Quartet is great. It looks great on my resume, and it was useful. And I learned a ton from a lot of these great classical players who coached me. But I also learned just as much by being with a bunch of rock musicians who never heard a string quartet in their life, of how to make a violin part that works with a guitar part. And if you're doing that, what do I do? And if the keyboard and if the drum with this kind of beat, should I emphasize this? I teach my kids about this, what I call the yin-yang of rhythm. There's downbeat energy and there's upbeat energy. And any good groove has a combination of stuff that's on the beat and stuff that's off the beat. And how you use that in a jam situation. How it's always better to err on the side of the offbeat, because it lightens up. Like if you have Brazilians are great for this. But if you have a groove that's like, if you're doing you're going to really make a rhythm section lighter and happier, as opposed to I tell them it's like you're on a sled, like sled dogs. Like you have the rhythm section, your bass drum, piano, whatever, guitar. They're the dogs pulling the sled, and you can either be on the sled jumping up and down and making it really hard for them to pull, or you can be kind of behind the sled pushing and and they feel like, wow, it got lighter. So you can have that influence. I never would have learned that had I not been in rock bands. So there's stuff like that. There's really valid musical stuff going on, and it's really important as classically trained people to not look down our noses at that, because that's real. And sometimes for kids, they get that, and then they can bring that to a string quartet or bring that to a piano trio or something, because they know it that way rather than the other way, because it's much more natural for them this way. So anyway, yeah, musicians definitely have to have a lot of skills these days, including marketing and Facebook and socials and all of that kind of stuff, which is so important. And speaking of which, I just posted this morning about Chatterbird. If anybody's not familiar with Chatterbird, it's a brand new music ensemble here in town. Suddenly, this year, out of nowhere, we've got Chatterbird. There's another group called Parthenon Orchestra that's commissioning Nashville composers. There's a Nashville Composer Collective, which I'm a part of. There's Alias. There's all of this. There's Intersection, which is about to have their debut next week. A new music ensemble. There's all kinds of vibrant stuff going on. And for instance, the Chatterbirds, new music, bunch of new composers and stuff. There's a piece for electric guitar. There's all kinds of integration of exactly what I've been talking about. And if you can, get out there and see what's going on in this very vibrant place between classical and rock. there's a what used to be a no man's land is now becoming the place to be. So proud of Nashville for being a place where this is happening, and to be a part of that scene. So you should, if you can, if you're at all interested, pay attention to what's going on in that world, because that's where hopefully where your students will live, if they're serious about music. Time for a question or two, or I don't know what your schedule is.
I don't either. Any
Or maybe we don't.
final questions?
It happens occasionally with piano students and more with my violin students. And I'm going to preface this by asking, am I not correct that you were involved with one of the local youth orchestras?
Yes, Music City Youth Orchestra,
That's what I
NCYO.
thought. So the kid comes in and I put a piece of orchestra music on the stand, and their parent comes in with them and says, you need to teach my child how to do this thing. He doesn't know how to do it. Well, it's a non-standard technique. It's something non-classical and it's
chop.
like a chop.
Yeah.
Like a bluegrass chop. So, I have friends who play bluegrass. I've seen how they do it. If you dropped me into an ensemble that was doing chops, I could make it sound right, but nobody's going to come to me and, pay to learn to do a chop because I wouldn't do it in the traditional way. So up till now, my solution has been to tell the parent, well, don't worry, this is a non-standard, non-classical technique. Surely the director of the orchestra will have the orchestra all learn it together and get it the way they want it. And then it occurs to me, well, especially with retro orchestras, there are a lot of teachers out there who don't play the violin teaching string orchestras.
Right.
You've got an oboe teacher or a singer teaching the string orchestra. And, if I quadrupled the amount I charge my students, I couldn't go around and have lessons in, every form they're going to run into.
Right.
What is the solution here?
It's a tough question. Well, it's good to know what you don't know, first of all. I hesitate to say, well, teach them as close as you can, or what you think it should be, or something like that.
The orchestra conductor may have a different idea.
Right. I think, what's important is if it's something to really feel like it's out of your, territory, your expertise, it's important to say that. If you think you have an idea what it is, but it's not maybe what they want, teach them as best you can. It sounds like that's what you were doing. I think it's the most important thing, though, would be to stress that this is valid, that it's not nonsense because it's not classical, and that the student needs to find somebody, either the orchestra director or somebody who can help them to figure out what it is, point them in my direction, even if it's just an email, hey, I've got this thing, do you know anybody who can help teach this? Can you teach them? Or do you have a student or something like that? Just to network a little bit on their behalf and try to point them in the right direction, basically, I guess is what I'm saying.
Hopefully without losing the students who bluegrass teaching.
Right. And if you do, I hate to say it, but if you do, that's probably the right thing for the student. Because if they're more interested in bluegrass, I have one method of teaching, and that is follow the student. I always, and this is very different from not everybody agrees with this, but this has worked for me because I teach non-traditional violin. So, they come into their first lesson with me if they're new to Belmont, and I say, well, what do you want to play? What do you like? Do you want to be a jazz player? Do you want to be a fiddler? Do you want to be a rocker? And sometimes they don't really know, or they have an idea. At Belmont, often they have a very clear idea. Those kids are very motivated. And I always go with that, because I have sort of a bag of tricks that I can help them with jazz. I can help them with rock. And often I help them with their classical stuff by teaching them techniques that I have developed learning rock. For instance, I have actually a technique, I won't go into details because I'm taking a lot of time here, but just to show you kind of how this plays out, I have a technique, a method that I've actually written a book about called strum bowing. And it's something that I learned after years of playing with Turtle Island, doing the chop and doing the stuff, and they taught me how to do this, and I sort of learned the technique. But it wasn't until years later that I suddenly realized that this is actually, there's a bigger picture here. This is similar to the way guitar players strum and keep time, and it's similar to the way drummers keep time on a hi-hat. It's basically subdivisions with your bow. So I developed this bowing style that helps to create a more a pop rhythmic kind of sound. So you can sound like a guitar player, like, you know, it doesn't sound stiff and classic. I teach that to everybody who is even slightly interested in, often even if they're not, because it's broadening their technique base as a classical player. And often with classical players, I'll do a master class for straight up classical players, and they'll be playing something for me, you know, totally classical, round of capricioso or whatever. And like, well, this part of over here needs to groove better. And they'll look at me like, my teacher never used that word, you know. And, you know, I'm sorry if it's Mozart, you know, it is Mozart, but Mozart grooves, Bach grooves, you know. And what that means is the tempo doesn't change. That, you know, that the sense of subdivision has to be there, physicalized in your arm, in your body, in your knees, in your hips. That all reflects in the way you're going to play that, rather than like this, you know, because this is never going to groove. It just won't, you know. And you know, Mozart is full of this, right? Bum dun dun ba 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 da ba da, right? The second violin right after that has right, all 16th notes. If that's not supposed to groove, then I'm totally misinterpreting Mozart all these years, because that is nothing but energy and groove and rhythm. And if you can play it like this and play them all absolutely equally, but guess what? That's not groove. Grooves happen when things are not even, when they're not equal. When you go something like that has some kind of a groove to it. Does not groove. And I was taught to do this, to play evenly, as perfectly evenly as you can. Dun, dun, ba, 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 bum. You know, make it like a machine, you know, because it's perfecting a certain discipline. And yeah, you know, it is perfecting a discipline, but guess what? It's really not useful in that context. That may be very useful for learning how to do other things and to develop the technique, but don't actually put that on stage. Mozart would kill you if you were around. He'd be like, what are you doing? You're killing me, you're ruining my piece. You know, so that's the kind of, you know, approach that I try to bring to students. And you know, in terms of even in classical music, there's so much that you can learn from other stuff that you can bring into that. So I guess just to answer your question, it's important to make sure that they understand that that is valid, these non-classical techniques, and to find a way to do it. If you can't teach it to them, help them find somebody who can. Like I said, if they end up going to bluegrass and doing that, they're getting more out of that. Let them go. It doesn't mean they won't come back. May not come back to, you know, maybe it'll be years later, maybe they won't be in Nashville and won't come back to you, but maybe they'll come back to another classical teacher somewhere else, and maybe somebody else will come to you after having
Most
that.
of mine aren't old enough to know one style from another. I mean, these rock music they're presenting with are as old as I am, you know, it's not, it doesn't sound like pop music to them, so.
Yeah.
Yes, but thank you.
All right. Well, do you have time to play?
Yeah, man,
something?
let's jam something.
All right.
Yeah.
I sent Mr. Silverman was very generous and asked to do something that I had composed, and so I sent him a video of it with the key that it's in. We've not rehearsed this, so you'll just get to see him work his magic, because it's pretty amazing.
This is how we do it on the Jim Brockman Show.
All right.
When we recorded, it's been 7 years ago now, 7 or 8 years ago. I was a bit insulted, I have to say, because I sent this song, and there was interplay between the two, and I said, okay, how much is it going to be? And he quoted me one price for, well, you know, if I get it done in a couple of hours, it's this, and you know, if it takes me all day, and I'm like, well, it'll probably take all day because this is pretty intricate. And he sent it back, and I saved money, but it was definitely, he went from having never heard the piece to composing his part and recording it in like 2.5 hours. And to me, that was just, that definitely changed the way I thought about what was possible.
Well, that's because it was a good piece. Now, if it hadn't been a good piece, it would have taken all day to figure out how to do it.
You need me?
Yeah. Wow, that's up there. That's about 443 or 4. And I brought my acoustic, which I almost never play anymore. Because it, with a gear and an amp. Actually, my electric's in here if you want it. It's over here.
Oh, cool.
Actually, yeah.
It frets like a guitar. It's
That's
crazy.
awesome.
So, I only listen to it once. So just just hit it, and I'll just
All right.
do whatever.
Sounds good. So, like, opening part, sing C minor, and then we go to C major for the chorus.
class, major or minor at the
No, no name yet.
Awesome, beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Great to meet you
The
guys.
30th birthday song.
There you go.
Very nice.
Thank you, thank you.
Well.
Can you
and
hold up, can you hold your electric
The electric
violin
sure.
up